Do you think sunlight is just something that makes you squint? Step outside. Tilt your face upward. Feel the warmth on your skin. You call that sunshine. But what's really happening is far more intense. Right now, an ultraviolet photon that left the surface of the sun exactly 8 minutes and 20 seconds ago is hurtling toward you at 186,286 miles per second, crossing 93 million miles of absolute vacuum without slowing down even a fraction. It has no color, no intention, no purpose. It simply carries about 4.4 electron volts of energy, just enough to break a specific chemical bond in a molecule located in the outermost layer of your skin, just enough to alter the structure of matter. And from that moment, everything begins. According to Einstein's special relativity in 1905, for the photon itself, no time passes at all. Its departure from the sun and its collision with your skin are the same event. But for you, it's different. For you, it's the starting point of a chain of biological reactions. One photon, one carbon bond broken, one molecule reshaped, one hormone produced, more than 200 genes beginning to readjust their activity. You don't hear the bond snap. You don't feel the genes switch on. But it happens every day. For decades in the United States, people have been told a very simple phrase: go outside, get out there, get a little sun. That advice sounds like everyday intuition, like your grandmother's wisdom rather than science. But the issue isn't that the intuition is vague. The issue is that it lacks the language to describe what physics is actually doing. We think medicine is something you swallow or inject. But if I define medicine precisely an agent that alters the physiology of the body, then sunlight meets that definition completely. It changes hormones. It changes gene activity. It changes bones, blood vessels, sleep. And you get it for free every day without even naming it. What I want you to see is not a moral lecture. What I want you to see is a mechanism, an equation running between a star 93 million miles away and your body. When you step outside, you're not just standing under light. You're activating your biology. And once you truly understand that a tiny photon can control more than 200 genes, sunlight stops being just light. It becomes a real biological drug. So now, let's break everything down and see how the mechanism actually works. No slogans, no intuition, just light and molecules. When a UVB ultraviolet photon with a wavelength of about 290 to 315 nanometers hits your skin, it doesn't shine in any poetic sense. It penetrates the epidermis and encounters a molecule placed there for exactly this purpose: 7-dehydrocholesterol, a cholesterol derivative embedded in the cell membranes of your skin. Your body actively synthesizes this molecule, not by accident, as if waiting for an external signal. The photon carries roughly 4.4 electron volts of energy, and that number isn't decorative. It's precisely enough to break a specific carbon-carbon bond between carbon 9 and carbon 10 in the B ring of the molecule. When that bond breaks, the ring structure opens, and a new molecule is formed, provitamin D3. No enzyme, no intermediate hormone, just pure photochemistry. Electromagnetic energy directly interacting with the molecule's electron structure. That's the first step. And if you stop here, you've already seen enough to understand that light doesn't just warm the skin, it restructures matter. But the body isn't finished. Provitamin D3 is not yet stable. So at body temperature of about 37 degrees Celsius, thermal isomerization continues to rearrange the structure, and within 1 or 2 days, provitamin D3 becomes cholecalciferol, or vitamin D3. At this point, the molecule leaves the skin, enters the bloodstream, and reaches the liver, where it undergoes 25-hydroxylation to become 25-hydroxy-vitamin D, also called calcidiol, the storage form that doctors usually measure in blood tests. But calcidiol is still not the active hormone. It must travel to the kidneys, where the enzyme 1-alpha-hydroxylase adds another hydroxyl group, turning it into calcitriol, the truly biologically active form. And this is where things get interesting in a genetic sense. Calcitriol enters cells, crosses the nuclear membrane, and binds to the vitamin D receptor, VDR, a protein that functions as a transcription factor. When VDR is activated, it binds to DNA at regions called vitamin D response elements and regulates transcription. According to research by Hausler and colleagues in 2011, calcitriol can influence 200 to 300 genes involved in mineral absorption, immune function, cell growth, and tissue differentiation. Look at that chain again. A photon from the sun 93 million miles away breaks a carbon bond in your skin and ultimately affects hundreds of genes throughout your body. That's not a metaphor, that's biochemistry. One of the clearest effects of calcitriol is regulating calcium absorption in the small intestine. When vitamin D is deficient, your body absorbs only about 10 to 15% of the calcium you eat. The rest passes through and is excreted. When sufficient calcitriol is present, absorption rises to about 30 to 40%, nearly tripling. This determines your bone density over time, whether you maintain bone structure or gradually lose mineral. Now let's talk dosage, because everything in biology depends on dose. Michael Holick at Boston University has estimated that just 10 to 15 minutes of midday sun exposure on the arms and face can produce about 10,000 to 20,000 international units of vitamin D3 in the skin. By comparison, common supplement pills in the United States typically contain 400 to 1,000 IU. That means your skin, when given the right input, can produce far more vitamin D than a typical pill. And unlike oral supplements, this photochemical system has a built-in self-limiting mechanism. When enough vitamin D3 accumulates, further UV exposure converts the excess into inactive products like lumisterol and tachysterol molecules that don't continue the hormone chain. In other words, the pharmaceutical factory in your skin has a safety valve. You can't overdose on vitamin D from moderate sun exposure the way you can from high-dose supplements. Now put this mechanism in the US context, because geography determines photon flux. North of latitude 35, the line running through Memphis, Albuquerque, and Los Angeles from roughly November to February. Earth's 23.5 degree tilt forces UVB to travel through a thicker atmospheric path, and most of it gets absorbed before reaching the skin. Onhain's data show that about 40 to 60% of people over 65 living at northern latitudes have vitamin D levels below the recommended threshold, especially in late winter. On top of that, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency estimates that Americans spend about 90% of their time indoors. If you're over 65, that figure is often even higher. That means the 70-hydrocholesterol molecule is still sitting in your skin. The enzymes in your liver and kidneys are still ready. The VDR is still waiting for the signal, but the photons aren't arriving. The mechanism is perfect, but the input is missing. And when the input is missing, the equation doesn't run. That's the entire story of the first mechanism. Not belief, not opinion, but a measurable chain of events from a 219 nanometer wavelength all the way to the activity of hundreds of genes in your cell nuclei. If the first mechanism turns photons into hormones, this one turns photons into time. You think light enters your eyes to create images, so you can see the road, read books, drive, and yes, that's the tip of the iceberg. But behind that familiar visual system is another system entirely, silent and precise. In 2002, David Burson at Brown University proved the existence of intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, IPRGCs, retinal ganglion cells that are themselves light sensitive. Intrinsically means they contain their own photopigment, independent of rods and cones. That pigment is called melanopsin. And melanopsin has a peak sensitivity around 480 nanometers, the blue light of the morning sky. This is not random. Morning sky light is rich in blue wavelengths due to Rayleigh scattering in the atmosphere. Your system is calibrated to the sky, not to light bulbs. When a 480 nanophoton hits melanopsin, a cascade of protein conformational changes occurs, generating an electrical signal. That signal doesn't go to the visual cortex. It travels along a specialized pathway called the retinohypothalamic tract, straight to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, SCN, in the hypothalamus. The SCN contains only about 20,000 neurons, a tiny structure, but it is the central oscillator that controls your circadian rhythm. It decides when cortisol surges to wake you, when body temperature peaks in the afternoon, when melatonin is released to make you sleepy. And here's the key point. The human endogenous biological clock is not exactly 24 hours. Charles Czeisler and colleagues at Harvard in time isolation experiments showed an average cycle of about 24.2 hours, 24 astero, 0.2 hours or 12 minutes longer each day. You might say, so what? Multiply it in 5 days, you're off by an hour. In 2 weeks, you're living in a different time zone, not from jet lag, but from endogenous physics. Morning light is the reset mechanism. When melanopsin is strongly activated within the first hour after waking, the SCN adjusts its phase, pulling the 24.2-hour cycle back to 24 hours, synchronizing you with Earth's rotation. This is phase synchronization via photons. Now consider intensity, because physiology depends not just on wavelengths, but on photon density. Indoor light in the United States is typically 100 to 500 lux. A bright office might reach 500 lux, rarely over 1,000. Meanwhile, outdoor shade on a cloudy day can hit 10,000 to 25,000 lux. Direct midday sun can reach 50,000 to 100,000 lux. This isn't a twofold or threefold difference. It's tens or hundreds of times more. IPRGCs evolved under conditions of tens of thousands of lux. When you spend 90% of your time in 300 lux environments, the average the EPA estimates for Americans indoors, your SCN receives a signal orders of magnitude weaker than its design specification. The result? Reduced circadian amplitude. Morning cortisol doesn't rise high enough. Evening melatonin doesn't sharpen, and you experience what many call chronic fatigue. Additionally, after age 60, the eye's lens gradually yellows due to accumulation of short wavelength absorbing chromophores. 490 nm blue light gets filtered more heavily. That means even when you go outside, fewer blue photons reach melanopsin than when you were 25. 2 layers of impairment, less outdoor time and poorer light transmission. No wonder sleep disorders increase with age. But the corrective mechanism is physically clear. About 15 minutes of outdoor light within the first hour after waking can deliver 10,000 plus lux, enough to robustly activate melanopsin. You don't need to stare at the sun, just ambient outdoor light. When IPRGCs fire strongly, the SCN readjusts phase, suppresses daytime melatonin, and allows it to rise at night on schedule. Cortisol releases on time, keeping you alert. Body temperature rises and falls rhythmically. Even peripheral gene expression in the liver and heart synchronizes. This isn't lifestyle advice. This is neurooptics. Morning light doesn't just make you feel better, it sets the timing parameters for your entire physiology. And once you realize your endogenous clock defaults to 24.2 hours, you see that every morning without outdoor light is an accumulating error. Every morning with it is a correction. If the first mechanism shows photons can control 200 genes via VDR, the second shows photons can control the entire rhythm of hormones and behavior via the SCN. You're not just a chemical creature, you're a temporal creature. And light is the only clock signal this system accepts. Light doesn't just control time, it controls mood. And here we enter the third mechanism, the serotonin axis. In 2002, Gregory Lambert and colleagues published a study in The Lancet that I consider bold in the truest physiological sense. They didn't ask people how they felt in sunlight. They directly measured serotonin turnover by sampling blood from the internal jugular vein, the drainage pathway from the brain. That's not a psychological questionnaire, that's real field biochemistry. They compared serotonin production on bright light days versus dim light days, and the result was clear. Brain serotonin synthesis rises in direct proportion to the light intensity reaching the retina. More photons, more serotonin, fewer photons, less serotonin. And this relationship holds independent of temperature or calendar season. It depends only on actual light entering the eyes. Now place this beside one of the most prescribed drug classes in the United States, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs. SSRIs don't create new serotonin, they block reuptake at the synapse, keeping it around longer in the synaptic cleft to enhance signaling. In other words, drugs slow removal. Light does something else. It increases synthesis. One adjusts output, the other adjusts supply. And once you grasp this, you see that morning light isn't sentimental therapy. It's a direct biological input into the neurotransmitter system. Serotonin isn't just a happy hormone as pop media often calls it. It's a foundational neurotransmitter influencing motivation, impulse control, sense of satisfaction, and crucially for our story, it's the precursor to melatonin. At night, the pineal gland converts serotonin into melatonin, the sleep onset hormone. So the light serotonin-melatonin axis is a continuous chain. If you get strong light during the day, melanopsin activates. iPRGCs signal not only to the SCN but also to the rapid nuclei in the brainstem, where serotonin is produced. Daytime serotonin rises, and when darkness arrives, plenty of raw material is available to convert into melatonin. Deeper sleep, clearer cycles. If daytime light is weak, serotonin stays low. Nighttime melatonin stays low, and you enter a loop. Poor sleep, fatigue, less outdoor time, even less light. This isn't morality, it's systems dynamics. Now look at the northern United States. In winter, daylight hours drop about 30 to 40% compared to summer. In states like Minnesota, Michigan, or Maine, December days can be 6 hours shorter than June days. That means total retinal photon input drops dramatically for weeks on end. Seasonal affective disorder emerges precisely in that context, not mere winter blues, but a recurrent mood disorder tied to reduced natural light. Interestingly, the standard treatment for SAD isn't pep talks, it's 10,000 lux light therapy. Light boxes deliver roughly 10,000 lux at eye level for 20 to 30 minutes each morning. The 10,000 lux figure isn't arbitrary. It approximates outdoor shade levels. When patients sit in front of this light source every morning, depressive symptoms decrease. Why? Because photons activate melanopsin, boost serotonin synthesis via the rapid nuclei, readjust SCN phase, and restore nighttime melatonin amplitude. The mechanism isn't psychological, it's neurooptic. And if you revisit Lambert's study, you see the change in serotonin turnover between bright and overcast days isn't trivial. It's directly measurable in jugular venous blood. That means every day you spend in 300 lux instead of 15,000 lux, you're altering your brain's baseline biochemistry. I'm not saying light replaces all medical interventions. Clinical depression is complex and multifactorial. But I am saying that in a biology evolved under the sun, photons are a fundamental input variable. When you remove them from the equation, you don't just change vitamin D, you change brain chemistry. And this explains something many people feel but can't articulate. Why stepping outside under a bright morning sky can produce an immediate shift in how you feel. Not because fresh air has magic, but because in a few minutes, millions of photons have activated melanopsin, increased signaling to the SCN and rapid nuclei, and readjusted serotonin flow. The feeling is chemistry. Chemistry is physics, and physics begins with light. So when we say light is a drug, we're not speaking metaphorically. We're saying an external agent, photons, enters your central nervous system, alters the synthesis rate of a major neurotransmitter, and from there changes mood, sleep, and behavior. That's the physiological definition of a drug. The only difference is you don't need a prescription. You need to step outside. And if you think the story stops at hormones and mood, wait, there's one more layer of physics. Because light also directly impacts your cardiovascular system through a mechanism completely independent of vitamin D. Richard Weller at the University of Edinburgh asked a question few in dermatology at the time wanted to hear. What happens if sunlight does more than just damage skin or produce vitamin D? He and his team focused on the UVA band, wavelengths around 315 to 400 nanometers longer than UVB, lower energy per photon, but with greater ability to penetrate deep into the dermis. In your skin exist reservoirs of nitric oxide in the form of nitrite and S-nitrosothiols, compounds that store NO in tissue. Nitric oxide is a tiny but extremely powerful gas molecule, a vasodilator well known in cardiovascular physiology. Normally, NO is produced endogenously by the enzyme nitric oxide synthase in the vascular endothelium. But Weller pointed out that skin is not just a passive shell, it is a reservoir. When UVA rays hit the skin, photon energy breaks the bonds holding nitric oxide in its stored form, releasing now directly into the circulation. No need to go through the liver, no need to go through the kidneys, no need for vitamin D metabolism, just photons and molecules. The anode then diffuses into the smooth muscle layer of vessel walls, activating the enzyme guanylate cyclase, which converts GTP into cyclic GMP, cGMP, and cGMP, lowers intracellular calcium levels in smooth muscle, leading to vasodilation. Blood vessels dilate, peripheral resistance drops, blood pressure falls. This is not vague hypothesis. Weller and colleagues used temperature-controlled UV lamps to eliminate the warming factor, and they blocked UVB to prove the effect is independent of vitamin D. Blood pressure dropped after UVA exposure, and the effect occurred even when vitamin D levels did not change. This means sunlight has a third pathway besides vitamin D and serotonin that directly impacts the cardiovascular system. Now put this in the US epidemiological context. According to the CDC in 2022, about 695,000 Americans die each year from cardiovascular disease, including myocardial infarction and stroke. Compare that to melanoma, the most dangerous form of skin cancer, which causes about 8,000 to 9,000 deaths per year. I'm not saying melanoma isn't serious. It is very serious. But when you look at population scale, you see a difference of nearly 2 orders of magnitude. Weller argues that if moderate sun exposure reduces blood pressure, and thereby reduces cardiovascular risk even by a small fraction, the number of lives saved could far exceed the number of deaths from melanoma. This is an all-cause mortality analysis, not looking at one disease in isolation. When you look only at skin, you might conclude avoid sun at all costs. But when you look at the whole body and whole mortality data, the picture changes. Sunlight carries risks, yes. UVA and UVB can cause DNA damage, yes. But UVA also releases nitric oxide, causing vasodilation and lowering blood pressure. And high blood pressure is one of the leading risk factors for stroke and heart disease. The no-guanylate cyclase cGMP mechanism is the foundation for many cardiovascular drugs. Nitroglycerin, for example, works by releasing nitric oxide. Here, light is doing the same thing through a photochemical pathway. And this raises an interesting question. If we already accept that a molecule that releases NO can be a drug, then why not view UVA photons that release NO as a similar biological agent? I'm not advocating excessive sun exposure. Physics never forgives overuse. But I am pointing out that your system is designed to interact with light. Nitric oxide in the skin does not exist by accident. It is part of a regulatory mechanism. When you spend most of your time indoors, under UV filtering glass and weak fluorescent lights, you remove an input that your vasculature may have evolved to use. And when you combine all 3 mechanisms, vitamin D regulating genes and calcium absorption, melanopsin regulating the clock and serotonin, and UVA releasing nitric oxide to lower blood pressure, you start to see a pattern. Light is not a minor environmental factor. It is a multi-system regulatory variable. And when we talk about drug, we mean an external agent that can predictably alter physiology. UVA does that. It activates guanylate cyclase, increases cGMP, dilates vessels, and reduces blood pressure. This is independent of vitamin D, independent of mood, independent of circadian rhythm. It's a separate pathway. And when you place the 695,000 cardiovascular deaths next to the 8,000, 9,000 melanoma deaths, you are forced to think systemically, not fearfully in one direction. Science is not picking one risk and ignoring all benefits. Science is balancing dose, balancing data, and understanding that the same photon can both cause damage and activate protective mechanisms. The question is not, is sun good or bad, but what dose is optimal for the whole body? And when you approach the problem that way, nitric oxide and blood pressure become an unavoidable part of the sunlight story. And now we have to bring this entire story down to the map, because photons do not fall equally everywhere. Latitude determines the angle of incidence, and the angle of incidence determines how much UVB reaches your skin. There is an imaginary line running across the United States at about latitude 35, passing through Memphis, Albuquerque, and near Los Angeles. South of this line, for most of the year, UVB is strong enough to trigger the vitamin D synthesis response. North of this line, from roughly November to February, Earth's 23.5-degree tilt forces UVB rays to travel through a much thicker atmospheric path before reaching the ground. Ozone and other atmospheric molecules absorb most of the 290-315 nanometers wavelengths. The result is that even on a sunny day, UVB reaching your skin is insufficient for effective vitamin D synthesis. That means you can stand under a clear blue sky in Boston or Chicago in January and produce negligible vitamin D. The 70-hydrocholesterol molecule is still there. The enzymes in the liver and kidneys are still ready, but the photons of the right wavelength aren't arriving. This is not opinion. This is orbital geometry. At Boston, around 42 degrees north, and Chicago, around 41 degrees north, the winter deficit in vitamin D has been clearly documented in population data. Anshan's The National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey shows that vitamin D deficiency rates rise sharply by late winter, especially among people over 65 and in northern states. Many analyses indicate that 40 to 60% of older adults at these latitudes have 25-hydroxyvitamin D levels below the threshold considered adequate. And when you combine geography with behavior, the picture becomes even clearer. Environmental living surveys show that older Americans spend about 80% of their time indoors, and in many cases the figure is even higher. This is especially true in assisted living facilities, long-term care settings, where residents often have limited outdoor activity due to safety, weather, or health reasons. Imagine the equation. You live in Chicago, December. UVB already low. You stay indoors most of the time. Window glass blocks nearly all UVB. The result is that for weeks, possibly months, the photochemical chain producing vitamin D does not run. At the same time, indoor light at 200-500 lux is not strong enough to optimally activate melanopsin. And if you go outside less, you also receive less UVA to release nitric oxide. Geography, architecture, and lifestyle combine to create a population-scale photon deficit. The interesting thing is that this does not happen uniformly across the country. In Los Angeles, around 34 degrees north, winter still has sufficient UVB at midday to produce vitamin D if you go outside. In Memphis, around 35 degrees north, you're on the boundary. In Boston, you're not. So the same avoid sun recommendation can have very different consequences depending on location. And when you look at the U.S. map, you see that tens of millions of people live north of latitude 35. If you add to that the fact that older adults, the group at highest risk for osteoporosis, hypertension, and sleep disorders, are also the group that spends the most time indoors, you begin to see a paradox. We protect them from sunburn risk, but we may simultaneously deprive them of a biological input their bodies are designed to receive. This does not mean unlimited sun exposure. Physics doesn't allow that, but it does mean geographic context matters. Someone in Albuquerque, around 35 degrees north but at higher elevation, with clearer skies and thinner air, receives more UV than someone in Chicago. A resident of an assisted living facility in Boston may get insufficient UVB from November to February, even with large windows. When you overlay all the mechanisms, UVB-dependent vitamin D, UVA-dependent nitric oxide, light intensity-dependent serotonin and circadian rhythm, and place them on the U.S. latitude map, you see that light is not just a personal issue. It is a geographic issue. And if you live north of latitude 35, especially in winter, you must recognize that your natural photochemical mechanisms are being limited by Earth's orbit. That is not fate, but it is physics. And physics always wins. Once you place light on the latitude map, you have to place it on the biological map on our very skin, because not every skin processes photons the same way. Melanin, the pigment that determines skin color, is a molecule that strongly absorbs ultraviolet radiation, especially UVB. Physically, melanin acts as a natural optical filter. It absorbs photons and dissipates the energy as heat, protecting underlying DNA from damage. That is an excellent defense mechanism. But like every biological system, there is a trade-off. If UVB is absorbed more in the upper epidermis, fewer photons reach 70-hydrocholesterol deeper down to initiate the vitamin D reaction. That means a person with darker skin, containing more melanin, needs longer sun exposure time to synthesize the same amount of vitamin D as someone with lighter skin. Many estimates show the difference can be 3 to 5 times depending on pigmentation level. This is not a cultural issue. It is photon absorption physics. Now look at evolution. Early Homo sapiens evolved near the equator in Africa, where UV radiation is strong and stable year-round. In that environment, selective pressure favored protecting folate and DNA from UV damage. High melanin was an advantage. It reduced mutation risk and reproductive harm. But about 20,000 to 50,000 years ago, groups began migrating to higher latitudes in Europe and Asia. In those regions, especially in winter, UVB was significantly weaker. Selective pressure shifted. Now, the problem was not too much UV, but too little to produce vitamin D. Over thousands of years, populations at high latitudes evolved lighter skin, reduced melanin to allow more UVB photons to penetrate and trigger the photochemical response. This is not a social story. It is a spectral story. The solar radiation spectrum at 50 degrees north differs from that at the equator. The pigment system adapted to that spectrum. But in the modern world, geography and genetics no longer always match. Millions of African Americans live in northern states like Illinois, Michigan, or New York, where winter UVB is already limited. When you combine high latitude with high melanin content, you have two layers of photon filtering, atmosphere and pigment. It is no surprise that NHANES data show higher vitamin D deficiency rates among African Americans, especially in the northern U.S. This is not because their physiology doesn't work. It is because photon absorption physics changes the input. Melanin absorbs UVB before it reaches the photochemical target. That is the Beer-Lambert law in human skin. The more absorber, the fewer photons transmitted. And it is important to understand that melanin was an evolutionary advantage in high UV environments. It reduced DNA damage and skin cancer risk. But when the environment changes, when humans migrate or when lifestyles shift indoors, the balance shifts. The vitamin D synthesis mechanism does not auto-adjust to compensate for missing photons. It only responds to the photons that actually arrive. So when we talk about light as a drug, we must understand that optimal dose is not the same for everyone. The same light intensity produces different amounts of vitamin D depending on melanin levels. And that is not a matter of opinion. It is an optical absorption coefficient. Evolution tuned human skin to latitude over tens of thousands of years. But in recent centuries, and especially recent decades, migration and urbanization have changed the equation faster than evolution can catch up. The result is bodies optimized for equatorial skies, living under Chicago winter skies. And when you look at the story that way, you see that vitamin D deficiency in certain populations is not a mystery. It is a consequence of photon physics and evolutionary history. Light does not discriminate by culture, but skin absorbs light differently. And understanding that is understanding that our biology is written in the spectrum of the sun. If evolution laid the foundation for how we absorb light, then age changes how we respond to it. After age 60, something happens that few people discuss in physical terms. Circadian amplitude begins to decline. The clock still runs, but its signal weakens. Think of a pendulum oscillating with gradually shrinking amplitude. The SCN still generates an approximately 24-hour rhythm, but the peaks and troughs of hormones lose their sharpness. Cortisol, the hormone that helps you feel alert in the morning, normally surges in the first hour after waking. The so-called cortisol awakening response. But in people over 60, this peak is often flattened. Instead of a sharp rise, you get a sluggish curve. The result is prolonged grogginess. At the same time, melatonin, the hormone of darkness, also decreases with age. The pineal gland secretes less melatonin, and the timing can become phase shifted. This creates the phenomenon many older people describe. Waking up at 3 a.m., fully alert, and then unable to fall back asleep. That is not bad habits. It is a timing system that has lost amplitude. In addition, as we have already discussed, lens yellowing reduces transmission of 480 nanometer blue light to melanopsin. That means the morning signal to the SCN is weaker. You have a clock that is already oscillating weakly, now receiving a poorer reset signal. And when the reset is weak, phase can drift earlier, called advanced sleep phase, causing you to feel sleepy at 7 p.m. and wake before dawn. Sati Ankoli Israel at the University of California, San Diego has studied this issue for many years. She and her colleagues have shown that increasing exposure to bright light during the day, especially in the morning, can improve sleep efficiency in older adults. Bright light therapy, typically at around 2,500 to 10,000 lux depending on the protocol, helps increase circadian amplitude, reduce nighttime awakenings, and consolidate the sleep-wake cycle. This is not due to belief, but because photons more strongly activate melanopsin, send clearer signals to the SCN, and thereby increase the contrast between day and night in the hormone system. When cortisol rises on schedule and melatonin is suppressed during the day, you get more daytime serotonin and more nighttime melatonin. The entire light clock mood axis is strengthened. And what is notable is that the intervention here is not sleeping pills. Sleeping pills can sedate, but they do not correct clock phase. They do not increase amplitude. Light does. About 15 to 30 minutes outdoors in the morning at 10,000 lux or more can provide the signal the SCN needs to keep the cycle close to 24 hours. When you put this in the context of older adults spending most of their time indoors under 300 lux, you see why sleep disorders become so common. The system is designed to clearly distinguish between 100,000 lux daytime and near zero lux nighttime. We replace it with 300 lux daytime and 200 lux evening under artificial lights. Contrast drops and the clock loses orientation. So when talking about age and light, the story is not old people lose sleep. The story is old people have a weaker clock and need stronger signals. And that strong signal is not a pill. It is photons of sufficient intensity. If you increase daytime light and reduce blue light in the evening, you restore the day-night contrast that your nervous system evolved to read. And when contrast increases, sleep becomes deeper. 3 a.m. awakenings happen less often, and the endogenous cycle is anchored closer to 24 hours. Light here is not just environment. It is a tool for calibrating an aging clock. And in a system where time controls hormones, metabolism, and immunity, that calibration is far from trivial. When you understand that light resets the clock and regulates hormones, we must turn to an organ system where the consequences of light deficiency are not just fatigue or sleepiness, but broken bones and lost lives. Osteoporosis is not an abstract concept. It is the gradual loss of mineral density in the skeleton. By statistics, about 1/3 of women over 65 and 1/5 of men over 65 will be affected at a clinical level. That means millions of Americans enter old age with a weakening load-bearing frame. And if you go back to the photochemical mechanism at the beginning, you will see the connection is far from vague. Calcitriol, the active form of vitamin D, is the hormone that controls calcium absorption in the intestine. When calcitriol is sufficient, the intestine can absorb about 30 to 40% of ingested calcium. When deficient, that figure can drop to 10 to 15%. Pause here for a moment. If you eat the same amount of calcium but absorb only half, what does your body do? Blood calcium levels must be kept within narrow limits for nerves and muscles to function. If the intestine does not supply enough, the body withdraws from the largest bank, bone. Bone resorption increases. Density declines gradually over years. Low calcitriol is not just a number on a lab test. It is a signal that shifts the balance between bone formation and bone breakdown. And when bone density falls to a critical level, a minor fall can lead to a hip fracture. A hip fracture at age 75 is not like a wrist fracture at age 75. According to many epidemiological analyses, the one-year mortality rate after hip fracture ranges from about 20 to 30%, not because the broken bone itself kills, but because of the cascade that follows, the immobilization cascade. You are hospitalized, move less, lose muscle mass rapidly. Immobility increases risk of pneumonia from fluid buildup in the lungs. Prolonged bed rest raises risk of deep vein thrombosis and pulmonary embolism. Loss of muscle mass and endurance makes recovery harder. Each link in this chain increases mortality risk. And if you trace backward, you can go from embolism to immobility, from immobility to hip fracture, from hip fracture to low bone density, from low bone density to poor calcium absorption, from poor absorption to low calcitriol, and from low calcitriol to insufficient UVB photons in the skin. I am not saying light is the only factor. Nutrition, exercise, and hormones also play roles, but I am saying light is a fundamental input variable we often overlook. In older adults who already spend most of their time indoors, live at higher latitudes, and may have suboptimal diets, vitamin D deficiency becomes common. When calcitriol is low, not only does calcium absorption decrease, but muscle function also declines. Vitamin D receptors are present in muscle tissue. Deficiency is associated with muscle weakness and reduced balance. This increases fall risk, the first link in the chain. So photons do not just affect bone density. They affect muscle strength and neuromuscular coordination. They protect you at both ends, reducing fall risk and reducing fracture risk when a fall occurs. And when you place the 20-30% mortality after hip fracture next to the fact that just 10 to 15 minutes of midday sun can trigger the calcitriol chain controlling calcium absorption and gene expression, you begin to see that light is not a minor factor. It is part of a prevention strategy. In a biological system, everything is connected. A carbon bond broken in the skin can, through many steps, affect your skeletal structure 30 years later. And when we talk about osteoporosis and hip fractures, we are not just talking about brittle bones. We are talking about a mineral regulation, hormone, and movement system that depends on photons. Light deficiency does not break your bones immediately. It slowly shifts the balance year after year. And when the breaking point arrives, the consequences are not just orthopedic. They disrupt the entire physiology. So in the story of light as a drug, osteoporosis is clear evidence that photon effects can accumulate over decades and manifest at the moment you least expect. That is physics extended through biological time. And when you look at this chain coldly, you see that prevention does not begin in the operating room. It begins under the sky. If hip fracture is the final outcome of a multi-year physiological chain, then falling is the triggering link. And here, muscle enters the story centrally. Vitamin D does not only act on bone through calcium absorption, it acts directly on muscle tissue. Vitamin D receptors, VDR, have been identified in skeletal muscle fibers, especially type 2 fibers responsible for fast reflexes and explosive strength. When calcitriol binds to VDR in muscle, it regulates gene expression related to muscle protein synthesis, fiber growth, and mitochondrial function. Calcitriol deficiency does not just weaken bones, it weakens muscles. Muscle weakness in older adults often manifests as reduced walking speed, difficulty rising from a chair, and slowed reflexes when balance is lost. This is not just a strength issue, it is a neuromuscular coordination issue. Neuromuscular coordination depends on precise signaling between motor neurons and muscle fibers. Vitamin D plays a role in maintaining this function. When vitamin D levels are low, studies show increased postural sway, oscillation of posture when standing still. Postural sway can be measured on force platforms in the lab, recording small shifts in the body's center of mass. Larger sway amplitude means higher fall risk. This is not subjective impression. It is quantitative data. Many randomized controlled trials have tested a simple question: does vitamin D supplementation in deficient older adults reduce fall risk? Meta-analyses of these trials show an approximate 20% reduction in fall risk in adequately supplemented groups compared to controls. 20% may not sound huge, but in a population of millions, that is tens of thousands of prevented falls. Importantly, the effect is strongest in those who are truly deficient. If the system already has sufficient calcitriol, adding more does not create miracles. But when there is deficiency, restoring normal levels improves muscle strength and postural stability. This links directly to the photon story. If midday light triggers the calcitriol synthesis chain, and calcitriol increases gene expression in muscle, then every morning outdoors is not just vitamin D for bones, it is a signal maintaining strength and reflexes. In older adults, where sarcopenia age-related muscle loss has already reduced reserves, any additional factor impairing coordination can push them over the danger threshold. A small trip on a rug, a low step, a quick turn can be enough. When muscle reaction slows by a few hundredths of a second, you fail to correct your center of mass. When postural sway increases, the safety margin shrinks. And when bone density has already declined, as we discussed, the consequences of a fall are far greater. Therefore, muscle and bone are not separate stories. They are two ends of the same system regulated by a hormone originating from photons. Randomized controlled trials do not say light replaces exercise. Strength and balance training remain foundational, but they show that adequate vitamin D status is a necessary condition for optimal neuromuscular function. When you piece together the full chain light, vitamin D, number DER, in muscle, improved coordination, reduced postural sway, 20% lower fall risk. You see that photons are not a passive environmental factor. They are a risk modulating variable. And when you think about millions of people over 65 living at high latitudes, indoors 80% of the time, you see that the question is no longer, does sun darken skin? But how many optical signals does our musculoskeletal system receive to maintain stability? If muscle helps you avoid falls and bone helps you withstand impact, then the immune system is the silent front line defending against invisible enemies, and light intervenes in this system in no metaphorical way. Calcitriol, the active form of vitamin D, does not only regulate calcium absorption or gene expression in muscle, it also activates antimicrobial peptides, especially cathelicidin, a peptide capable of disrupting bacterial and viral membranes. When calcitriol binds to the vitamin D receptor in immune cells such as macrophages, it promotes transcription of the gene encoding cathelicidin. Macrophages then not only swallow bacteria but are equipped with stronger chemical weapons to destroy them. This is innate immunity at the molecular level. Vitamin D deficiency means weaker activation signals and lower cathelicidin production. This is not speculation. In vitro and in vivo studies show calcitriol levels correlate with antimicrobial peptide expression. This story has historical precedent. Before antibiotics, tuberculosis was treated with heliotherapy, sunlight therapy. Patients were placed on sun-facing balconies in sanatoriums. In 1903, Niels Finsen was awarded the Nobel Prize for using concentrated light to treat lupus vulgaris, a form of skin tuberculosis. At the time, the mechanism was unknown. No one spoke of cathelicidin or vitamin D receptors. They simply observed that light improved infection. Today we understand that UVB triggers the calcitriol synthesis chain. Calcitriol activates antimicrobial peptide genes, and macrophages become more effective. This is photoimmunology. Now look at the seasonal pattern. In the United States, especially in northern states, winter means not only shorter days, but far less UVB. As we have said, from November to February, vitamin D synthesis nearly stops at high latitude. The result is that blood 25-hydroxyvitamin D levels gradually decline through winter and reach their nadir lowest point around February or March. Coincidentally, that is also the peak season for respiratory infections. Influenza, RSV, and many other viruses spread during the same period when vitamin D is at its lowest. Multiple factors contribute: indoor crowding, low humidity, but the optical factor cannot be ignored. When UVB photons decrease, calcitriol decreases, cathelicidin decreases, and macrophage pathogen-killing capacity weakens. This is not a simple on-off switch. It is a change in probability. An immune system with adequate vitamin D signaling can respond faster and more forcefully. When the signal is weak, response time lengthens and pathogens gain opportunity to multiply. Light, in this way, is not a miracle cure, but a fundamental modulator of resistance. And when you recall that older adults spend most of their time indoors, live at high latitudes, and have lower than average vitamin D levels, you see a convergence of risks. Age-related immunosenescence combined with calcitriol deficiency. The result is more severe infections and slower recovery. When we look back at Finsen's history and the sun-filled balconies of sanatoriums, we see an intuition that was correct, now confirmed by molecular biology. Sunlight activates a gene chain that increases production of antimicrobial peptides. This does not replace vaccines or antibiotics, but it is a foundational layer of protection. And if you combine this with the serotonin, circadian, and nitric oxide stories, you see that light impacts immunity just as it impacts mood and blood vessels. A UVB photon does not know what you are thinking or where you live. It simply carries enough energy to break a carbon bond, initiate a hormone, and ultimately adjust a macrophage's ability to kill bacteria. That is physics translated into immunity. And when vitamin D reaches its nadir at the end of winter, the question is not just, why am I tired, but also, how many optical signals is my immune system receiving to function optimally? If the immune system weakens seasonally due to a lack of photons, then human mood also responds according to the same optical law, and seasonal affective disorder, SAD. The clearest example, in northern US states where daylight hours drop sharply in winter, SAD rates are significantly higher than in southern states. Some estimates suggest that at high latitudes such as New England or the upper Midwest, the rate may range from 5 to 10% of the population with full symptoms, and subthreshold symptoms are even higher. The pattern is highly consistent. As days shorten and natural light intensity decreases, mood declines accordingly. The standard treatment for SAD is not talk therapy or encouragement. It is high-intensity light. A 10,000 lux light box, roughly equivalent to outdoor light and shade, is used in the morning, typically for about 30 minutes each day. The 10,000 lux figure is not arbitrary. It far exceeds the 300 to 500 lux of indoor environments and is sufficient to strongly activate melanopsin in IPRGCs. When patients sit in front of this light source every morning for about 30 minutes, they receive a photon dose comparable to stepping outside under a bright sky. Numerous clinical studies show clinical response appearing after about 2 to 4 weeks of consistent use. This aligns with the biological mechanism. You do not change gene expression and readjust circadian rhythm in a single day. You need repeated reset signals to increase circadian amplitude, boost serotonin synthesis, and normalize the melatonin cycle. The mechanism is not mystical. 490 nanometer photons activate melanopsin. The signal travels via the retinohypothalamic tract to the SCN and Raphe nuclei. Daytime serotonin rises, nighttime melatonin is properly regulated. Gradually, the light serotonin-melatonin axis stabilizes. Many patients report that they not only feel less sad, but also sleep more deeply and have more stable energy during the day. That is the result of restoring day-night contrast. In the northern winter, daylight hours can drop 30 to 40% compared to summer. You do not just lose daylight time, you lose cumulative photon intensity. When total light dose decreases over many weeks, the nervous system responds. Light therapy is essentially dose compensation. It does not directly change thoughts. It changes optical input. Interestingly, the effectiveness of the light box depends on timing. Use in the morning within the first hour after waking is most effective, because that is when the SCN is most sensitive to phase resetting signals. Use in the evening can cause phase shifts in the opposite direction. This is physics of time, not belief. When you view SAD from this perspective, you see a mood disorder with a specific photochemical and neurooptic mechanism. Not all depression is sad, but SAD is an example showing that mood can depend directly on photons. And that reinforces our central argument. Light is not just background for life. It is a quantifiable biological agent that can be dosed and can produce measurable clinical change. When 30 minutes under 10,000 lux each morning for 2-4 weeks can alter a person's mood, you cannot continue to view light as a minor factor. You must view it as an optical drug with clear mechanisms and measurable response. If we are honest with science, we cannot talk about light as a drug while only discussing benefits. The same photons that activate vitamin D, nitric oxide, and serotonin can also cause DNA damage. UVB, the 290-315 nanometer band we have praised for its photochemical role, has enough energy to create thymine dimers in DNA. This occurs when two adjacent thymine bases on the same DNA strand form an abnormal covalent bond after absorbing a photon. The double helix structure is distorted. If not repaired, DNA replication can insert incorrect bases and create mutations. Your body is not passive in this. The nucleotide excision repair (NER) system evolved to detect distortions caused by thymine dimers. Enzymes recognize the damage, excise the damaged DNA segment, and resynthesize it using the complementary strand as a template. Every day, thousands of such lesions are repaired in each skin cell. But the system is not perfect. Repair efficiency declines with age. Like many other biological systems, enzymes work more slowly. Signals become less precise. That means the same UVB dose at age 70 may leave more unrepaired damage than at age 25. There are genetic conditions that clearly illustrate the role of NER. Xeroderma pigmentosum is a rare disorder in which genes encoding nucleotide excision repair proteins are mutated. These patients are virtually unable to repair UV-induced damage. Even mild sun exposure can lead to early and frequent skin cancers. This is living proof that the repair mechanism is essential. When it fails, UV becomes a major hazard. Even in normal individuals, if UV dose exceeds repair capacity, mutations accumulate. Some mutations can occur in genes controlling cell growth, such as p53 or BRAF. In melanoma pathogenesis, the BRAF V600E mutation is one of the most common alterations. Melanoma is not just severe sunburn. It is the result of accumulated mutations in melanocytes, the pigment cells. Risk increases with dose-dependent risk. Many epidemiological studies show that intermittent, high-intensity sun exposure, especially leading to sunburn in childhood and adolescence, is strongly associated with melanoma. Here, the biology of trade-offs becomes clear. UVB is necessary for vitamin D production, but can also create diamine dimers. UVA can release nitric oxide, but can also cause oxidative stress. The question is not whether light is good or bad. The question is dose and exposure pattern. Trade-off biology is a universal principle. Evolution did not optimize for absolute safety. It optimized for balance between benefits and risks in the ancestral environment. In that environment, humans spend much time outdoors, but with gradually varying intensity throughout the day, rarely experiencing extreme intermittent exposure like modern beach vacations. The repair system was designed for moderate, repeated doses. When you suddenly expose unadapted skin to high intensity for hours, you exceed repair capacity. That is when risk spikes. This does not negate the benefits of light. It places them in a dose framework. 10-20 minutes of midday sun can activate near maximum vitamin D synthesis, while still remaining within the skin's repair capacity. Beyond that, vitamin D does not increase linearly because of the self-limiting mechanism that converts excess provitamin D3 to lumisterol and testosterol. But DNA damage continues to accumulate with dose. That is asymmetry. Benefits plateau. Risks continue to rise. So when we say light is a drug, we must also say it has a therapeutic window. Below that level, you lack input. Above that level, you exceed repair threshold. And in the U.S. context, where melanoma causes about 8,000, 9,000 deaths per year, warnings about excessive sun exposure are entirely justified. But when we place that number next to the multi-system benefits photons provide, we cannot fall into binary thinking. Trade-off biology demands balance. Your body is equipped with both hormone activation systems and DNA repair systems. Both coexist because light environment was an evolutionary constant. Our task is not to eliminate light, but to understand dose, understand mechanisms, and respect cellular repair limits. That is the scientific approach to an agent that can both nourish and harm. No fear, no naivety, only physics, chemistry, and biology in dynamic equilibrium. Once you accept that light has both benefits and risks, the logical next question is not, should we avoid it or expose ourselves? But what is the optimal dose? In biology, as in pharmacology, dose determines effect. Photochemical data show that about 10 to 20 minutes of midday sun exposure, when UVB is strong enough, on areas such as arms, face, and if possible legs, is usually sufficient to activate near maximum vitamin D synthesis in most people with light to medium skin. Midday here means when the sun is at its highest, because that is when UVB rays pass through the thinnest atmospheric path, and the proportion of 290-319 nanometer photons reaching the surface is highest, when 70 hydrocholesterol absorbs enough photons to convert to provitamin D3. The system reaches a saturation point. Beyond a certain threshold, additional exposure does not increase vitamin D linearly, because of the self-limiting mechanism converting excess to lumistol and tachysterol. That is the vitamin D synthesis plateau. The factory has run at the necessary full capacity. However, UVB-induced DNA damage does not stop at that plateau. Thymine dimers continue to form with dose. So you have a window where benefits rise quickly and plateau, while risks continue to increase gradually. That is precisely the therapeutic window of light, in that 10-20 minute range, with sufficient skin area such as both arms and face and, if conditions allow, forearms or legs. You provide enough input for the hormone system while staying within the threshold that nucleotide excision repair can handle. Repair capacity threshold is not an exact number for everyone. It depends on skin type, age, sunburn history, and genetic factors. But the principle is clear, moderate. Repeated doses are far better than large, intermittent doses. If you go outside for 15 minutes every day rather than 3 hours once a week, you maintain stable optical signaling without exceeding repair capacity. After this optimal window ends, once you have received enough photons to activate vitamin D and circadian signals using sunscreen becomes sensible. Sunscreen after the optimal window is not a contradiction. It is a dose management strategy. You capture the initial photochemical benefits, then slow the accumulation of additional DNA damage. This is especially important for people with fair skin, family history of melanoma, or many nevi. Light is not the enemy, but it does not forgive excessive dose. In addition, exposed skin area affects the required time. If only face and hands are exposed, the smaller area may require slightly longer time to achieve the same vitamin D synthesis compared to including forearms or legs. But time should not increase indefinitely. The goal is to reach plateau without exceeding repair threshold. For people with darker skin, because melanin absorbs UVB more strongly, the required time may be longer, possibly several times longer, to reach the same vitamin D level. That does not change the principle of optimal dose. It only changes the duration within the window. In all cases, sunburn is a clear signal that you have exceeded threshold. Erythema is not a prerequisite for benefit. It is a sign of damage. The scientific approach is exposure just sufficient to activate the hormone and biological clock systems, then protect the skin from further damage accumulation. In pharmacological language, you are seeking the minimum effective dose, not the maximum tolerated dose. And when you understand light this way, you no longer see it as a vague environmental variable. You see it as a biological agent with defined dose, timing, and exposure area. That is how you turn a natural factor into an intentional intervention based on mechanism rather than fear or romanticization. When you understand the optimal dose of light and the mechanisms behind it, an uncomfortable question arises. If our biological systems are tuned by tens of thousands of lux outdoors, why do we live in a few hundred lux all day? The answer lies in very recent history. The Industrial Revolution changed the human light environment faster than any period of evolution. Before the 19th century, most humans worked outdoors or in open spaces with natural light. Then came factories, offices, then office cubicles, enclosed workspaces, low ceilings, fluorescent lights. We shifted from 50,000 lux skies to 300 lux rooms. At the same time, cars replaced walking. Previously, you walked to market, to fields, to workshops. Now you go from house to garage, garage to car, car to office. Photons are cut from the equation by windshields, windows, and indoor routines. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency estimates that Americans spend about 90% of their time indoors. 90% meaning only 10% remains for outdoor light exposure, and even that 10% is not always midday. We have restructured our optical environment within a few generations. Evolution has not had time to catch up, and it is not just intensity that changed, but spectrum as well. Sunlight is a continuous spectrum, rich in blue in the morning, and gradually shifting with solar angle. Modern LED lights, while energy efficient, have narrow emission spectra, often with strong blue peaks but overall low lux intensity. That is LED spectral mismatch. You can have visually bright white light, but total photons at 480 nanometers and overall intensity are insufficient to optimally activate melanopsin. In addition, in the evening we turn on screens and blue-rich LED lights right before bedtime. The system evolved to receive strong blue light in the morning and decreasing amounts toward evening. We reverse that pattern. Dark mornings indoors, bright screens at night. The biological clock becomes confused. When you look back at the entire chain of mechanisms, vitamin D requiring UVB, nitric oxide requiring UVA, serotonin and squint requiring high intensity, you see that indoor civilization has simultaneously reduced all three inputs. We have not just reduced outdoor time. We have replaced broad spectrum, high intensity light with low intensity artificial light of different spectrum. This does not mean we should return to living in caves. It means we must recognize that the modern optical environment is not the one our physiology was optimized for. Office cubicles are not the enemy, but they do not provide 10,000 to 50,000 lux. Cars bring convenience, but they reduce walking time under light. And when 90% indoor time becomes the norm, photon deficiency becomes the baseline variable. This is especially important for older adults in assisted living facilities, where schedules may limit natural light exposure, not because anyone intends harm, but because architecture and schedules are designed for safety and convenience, not photobiology. Civilization has solved many problems: infectious disease, heavy labor, harsh weather, but it has also unintentionally altered daily light dose. If light is a drug, then indoor civilization is an unprescribed dose reduction. And as with any drug, prolonged dose reduction can produce systemic consequences. Understanding this is not a call to romanticize the past. It is a reminder that our physiology still operates according to the spectrum and intensity the sun provides. The question is not returning to pre-industrial times, but how to reintegrate the minimum effective photon dose into modern life. Because the physics of light does not change when we invent the light bulb. When you place indoor civilization on the evolutionary timescale, you begin to see a near-shocking discrepancy. Homo sapiens has existed for about 200,000 years, and for nearly all of that time, the default environment was outdoors, under an open sky, with clear light-dark cycles and daytime light intensity routinely exceeding 10,000 lux. That is the outdoor evolutionary baseline, the standard light input our physiology was tuned to. Every system we have discussed, vitamin D synthesis, nitric oxide release, melanopsin activation, serotonin regulation, cathelicidin production, evolved under those conditions. No fluorescent lights, no LEDs, no enclosed offices. Light was not an accessory, it was foundational. Now compare that to the reality that industrial civilization with widespread electric lighting is only about under 150 years old. 150 years compared to 200,000 years. On an evolutionary scale, that is an almost negligible instant. Your genes have not had time to restructure. Your melanopsin does not know light bulbs. Your VDR does not adjust to respond to 300 lux. Your body still expects strong contrast between 50,000 lux daytime and near absolute darkness at night. This is the core of input mismatch theory. When the current environmental input deviates too far from the ancestral environment that biological systems were optimized for, you begin to see functional decline. We have seen this pattern with processed food and refined sugar. Metabolism evolved in conditions of energy scarcity, and when faced with constant surplus, metabolic disease increases. Similarly, the photosystem evolved under strong daytime light and true nighttime darkness. When you replace that with 300, 500 lux all day and screen blue light at 10 p.m., you create a dimmed and noisy signal environment. Circadian amplitude flattens, vitamin D drops, serotonin fluctuates, nitric oxide is not activated on its natural rhythm, not because the body is weak, but because the input no longer matches. Think of it as a control system calibrated for a specific signal range. If you reduce signal intensity to 1/10 for a prolonged period, the system still runs, but not at the optimal point. Modern civilization has done this unintentionally. Office cubicles, high-rise buildings with UV filtering glass, cars replacing walking, air conditioning keeping us indoors. 90% indoor time is not the exception. It is the norm. Evolution did not anticipate that. Evolution anticipated waking to gradually increasing light, activity under bright sky, and rest when darkness envelops. When you reverse that pattern, dark days, bright nights, you force temporary adaptation. But temporary adaptation does not equal long-term optimization. Mismatch does not mean we must abandon technology or return to hunter-gatherer life. It means we need to consciously reintegrate some ancestral inputs into modern structure. If the 200,000-year baseline is outdoor, then living almost entirely indoors is a sudden optical change. And every sudden change like that in biology has consequences. High vitamin D deficiency rates, widespread sleep disorders, SAD at high latitudes, elevated hypertension, and cardiovascular disease. Not all due to light, but light is a sharply reduced background variable. When you look at 200,000 years under the sun and 150 years under light bulbs, you understand that your body is not a product of the office. It is a product of the sky. And if you want that system to operate close to its original design, you must ask a simple question every day. How many photons have I provided to the body built to read light as a vital signal? That is not romanticizing nature. That is recognizing that the physics of light has shaped our biology far longer than any human invention. And when input deviates too far from the evolutionary baseline, adjustment must come from conscious behavior, not from new genes. Because your genes are still waiting for the sky. When you step out of evolutionary theory and look directly at nationwide US data, everything becomes quantitative, specific, and hard to ignore. According to the CDC, cardiovascular disease remains the leading cause of death, with about 695,000 deaths per year, equivalent to nearly 1 in 5 total deaths in the United States. That is not a side phenomenon. It is central to the national health picture. Hypertension, a key risk factor for myocardial infarction and stroke, affects nearly half of American adults, and in those over 65, the rate exceeds 70%. When you recall the UVA mechanism releasing nitric oxide from skin, activating guanylate cyclase, increasing cGMP, and causing vasodilation independent of vitamin D, you start asking seriously, what happens when a population spends 90% of its time indoors and rarely receives outdoor light intensity strong enough to activate that mechanism? Turning to vitamin D, NHANES data across multiple survey cycles show that average 25 hydroxyvitamin D levels in the US population tend to be lower at the end of winter and in northern states. Estimates suggest 30 to 40% of the population falls below the threshold considered optimal. And among those over 65, deficiency rates can reach or exceed 40%. This aligns with the fact that vitamin D synthesis capacity declines with age, and outdoor time drops sharply. The result is not just lab numbers. It links to osteoporosis, muscle weakness, increased fall and hip fracture risk. Sleep also reflects a similar trend. National surveys show tens of millions of Americans reporting chronic insomnia, difficulty maintaining sleep, or daytime sleepiness. In older adults, waking at 3 a.m. and being unable to fall back asleep is a common complaint. If the endogenous biological clock has a cycle of about 24.2 hours and requires strong morning light to reset each day, then a 300-500 lux indoor environment may not suffice. Depression and seasonal affective disorder add another layer of data. General depression rates in the United States hover in the double-digit percentage range, depending on age and gender. SAD rates are higher in northern states like Alaska, Washington, Minnesota, and Maine, where winter daylight hours drop 30-40% compared to summer. 10,000 lux light therapy for 30 minutes each morning has proven to improve symptoms within 2 to 4 weeks, reinforcing the neuro-optic photochemical mechanism over purely psychological. When you place all this data side by side, high cardiovascular mortality, prevalent hypertension in 65, NHANES documented vitamin D deficiency, significant sleep disorder prevalence, seasonal depression, you do not see a single cause. You see a potential biological common denominator. Light is a background variable influencing blood vessels, hormones, genes, immunity, and neurology simultaneously. It does not replace the role of nutrition, exercise, or social factors, but it interacts with all of them. In systems science, when a single input modulates multiple outputs, sharply reducing that input on a population scale can produce cumulative effects. CDC and NHANES data are not designed to prove photon deficiency as a diagnosis, but they show patterns consistent with the mechanisms we have analyzed. This is not a call to oversimplify. It is a call to expand the variables we consider. If 90% indoor time is the norm of modern civilization, then the light environment has changed systematically. When molecular mechanisms and population trends point in the same direction, the scientist does not rush to conclude, but neither does he ignore. Light may not be the sole protagonist in the national disease picture, but it may be an underappreciated lever. And in a nation where hundreds of thousands die from cardiovascular disease each year, millions struggle with sleep and mood, reconsidering that lever is not romanticizing the sun. It is data-driven systems thinking. Looking at that entire data picture, you might be tempted to think it is all just social trends, habits, or personal choices. But there is a deeper layer I want you to see. Physics does not negotiate. Earth is tilted 23.5 degrees relative to its orbital plane around the sun, and that tilt is why you have seasons. Not mood, not public health policy, pure geometry. When the northern hemisphere tilts away from the sun in December, the angle of incidence changes. The path photons must travel through the atmosphere lengthens, and photon flux photons per square meter per second decreases. That is orbital mechanics. Earth moves around the sun in a near elliptical orbit with a cycle of about 365.25 days. You can argue about diet. You can argue about lifestyle, but you cannot argue with Kepler's orbital equations. When the angle of incidence decreases, surface radiation intensity falls with the cosine of the angle. That is geometry. When the atmosphere is thicker along the photon path, scattering and absorption increase. That is atmospheric optics. The result is that in January in Boston or Chicago, UVB photons in the 290-315 nanometer band are nearly insufficient to activate the 70-hydrocholesterol reaction in skin, not because you do not believe, but because the photons do not arrive. Lux, the unit of illuminance, is simply lumens per square meter. It does not care what you think. In your living room, you might measure 200 to 300 lux. Under tree shade outdoors on a cloudy day, you might measure 15,000 lux. Under direct summer sun, 80,000 to 100,000 lux is not uncommon. Lux measurement science is not based on opinion. It is photometry, based on sensors and the human eye's sensitivity spectrum. When you go from 50,000 lux to 300 lux, you are not reducing by 10%. You are reducing by 2 orders of magnitude. Melanopsin in your retina responds to photons around 480 nanometers. It does not ask whether you believe in circadian rhythm. Nitric oxide in your skin does not ask whether you have read Weller's paper. 70-hydrocholesterol does not check your political views before absorbing UVB. Physics operates independently of belief. Earth's 23.5-degree tilt means that in winter, the sun's path across the sky is lower. Days are shorter. Photon flux decreases. That is why daylight hours in Minneapolis in December can be 9 hours shorter, while in June they exceed 15 hours. That is not perception. That is astronomy. When you combine axial tilt, orbit, Rayleigh scattering in the atmosphere, and ozone absorption of UVB, you have a natural system modulating the number of photons reaching your skin and eyes by season, and your body evolved to read that modulation. Lux measurement science allows us to quantify what our ancestors only felt. You can hold a light meter and see the difference between indoors and outdoors. Those are numbers, not poetry. And most importantly, physics does not negotiate with our desires. If you live at 42 degrees north latitude and stay indoors all winter, photon flux to your eyes and skin will be low. You may believe you are fine, but melanopsin and VDR only read photon counts. If you live in Phoenix in July and stay outdoors for hours at midday, UV index is high and DNA damage risk rises. You may love the sun, but time and dimers form according to dose-dependent probability. Physics neither favors nor punishes. It simply follows equations. Orbital mechanics does not pause because you are busy. Earth is still tilted 23.5 degrees. The orbit continues. Photons still leave the sun, then take about 8 minutes, 20 seconds to arrive here. What we can adjust is not Earth's axis, but our behavior within that physical context. Understanding that light intensity Angle of incidence, day length, and radiation spectrum are objective variables, helps you escape opinion-based arguments. We are not talking about belief. We are talking about geometry and photon flux. When you accept that your body is a photosystem living in a universe governed by orbital mechanics, you start thinking differently. You no longer ask, do I like sun? You ask, how many photons are hitting my system today? And the answer, like it or not, is always determined by physics before it is determined by you. Once you accept that physics does not negotiate, that Earth's axis is tilted 23.5 degrees and photon flux changes with the seasons regardless of personal opinion, the next step is to look directly at a simple but rarely named concept: photon deficit. We talk about oxygen deficit when climbing high mountains, about exercise deficit when sitting too long, about nutrient deficit when diet is insufficient. But we very rarely talk about photon input deficit, lack of the high-intensity light input our biology is designed to receive every day. This is not lack of air. Regulatory systems ensure you have enough oxygen. It is not lack of exercise. You can go to the gym for an hour a day, but if you spend most of your time in 200, 500 lux environments, you are operating a photosystem at low signal levels. Think of the indoor aging model. In that model, a person wakes up, turns on a 150 lux bedroom light, moves to a 300 lux kitchen, drives to the office with UV filtering glass, sits under 400 lux LEDs for 8 hours, returns home at dusk, watches screens emitting low-intensity blue light. Total photon input that day is lower than a 20-minute morning outdoors on a cloudy day. This is not metaphor. It is a difference measurable with a lux meter. If outdoor shade is 15,000 lux and indoors is 300 lux, you are receiving 1/50th the intensity. If you are indoors 10 hours, you may accumulate far fewer total photons than 30 minutes outdoors. Quantifiable exposure gap is not a vague concept. You can wear a personal light meter and record the difference. When we talk about calorie deficit, we calculate calories. When talking about photon deficit, we can calculate lux hours. How many lux multiplied by how many hours? A day at 300 lux for 10 hours is 3,000 lux hours. 30 minutes at 20,000 lux is 10,000 lux hours. Just half an hour outdoors can exceed an entire day's indoor light. If the melanopsin system needs 1,000, 2,000 lux to fire strongly and synchronize the SCN, then many hours at 300 lux may not suffice to create signal amplitude. If UVB needs to reach threshold to trigger the photochemical reaction in skin, then windows and walls can block nearly all of that component. The indoor aging model assumes that over time, repeated deficit of high-intensity photon input may contribute to circadian flattening, vitamin D decline, lower nitric oxide release, and indirectly to consequences on bone, blood vessels, and mood. The important thing is not to confuse concepts. Photon deficit does not mean you never go outside. It means total high-intensity light input is below evolutionary baseline. You can exercise on a treadmill in a 400 lux gym. Your heart rate rises, muscles work, but melanopsin and 7-dehydrocholesterol do not receive the same signal as under sky. You can breathe filtered indoor air. That is good for lungs, but photons are still reduced. This is not an indictment of civilization. It is identification of a variable. If you live in an environment where outdoor light is replaced by low-intensity artificial light, you are participating in a large-scale biological experiment. And like every experiment, there is an implicit control group, our evolutionary history. Quantifiable exposure gap allows us to move from intuition to measurement. Instead of saying, I go outside quite a bit, you can ask, how many lux hours above 1,000 lux did I receive today? When you ask that way, you begin to see photons as a quantifiable input, not just a feeling of warmth on skin. And if indoor aging involves gradual decline of photosignals, then restoring some photon input may be a simple intervention, not a miracle, not a replacement for modern medicine, but adjustment of a fundamental variable. Because after all the analysis of orbital mechanics and lux measurement science, the practical issue returns to a simple question. Has your system received enough photons today? Looking back at the concept of photon deficit and that quantifiable exposure gap, all the mechanisms we have gone through begin to align into a unified system. Vitamin D is no longer a supplement on a shelf. It is the direct result of UVB penetrating the epidermis, breaking the 9-10 carbon bond in 7-dehydrocholesterol, and initiating the hydroxylation chain in liver and kidneys to produce calcitriol, the hormone controlling 200 to 300 genes. Circadian entrainment is no longer advice to sleep early and wake early. It is melanopsin in IPRGCs reading 490 nanometer photons, sending signals via the retinohypothalamic tract to the suprachiasmatic nucleus of about 20,000 neurons, resetting the endogenous 24.2-hour clock to true 24-hour geographic time. Serotonin is no longer just a term in antidepressant ads. It is a molecule synthesized more when strong light stimulates the retinopathy pathway, providing precursor for nighttime melatonin and regulating the mood-sleep axis. Nitric oxide is no longer just a biochemical concept. It is a molecule released from skin reservoirs when 315 to 400 nanometers UVA triggers a photochemical reaction, dilating vessels via guanylate cyclase and cGMP, lowering blood pressure independent of vitamin D. Bone does not depend only on dietary calcium. It depends on calcitriol to raise absorption from 10 to 15% to 30 to 40%, determining mineral density and hip fracture risk. Muscle does not need only protein and exercise. It has vitamin D receptors in muscle fibers, influencing protein synthesis and neuromuscular coordination, reducing fall risk by about 20% in randomized controlled trials. The immune system does not rely only on antibiotics and vaccines. It uses calcitriol to activate antimicrobial peptides like cathelicidin in macrophages, a mechanism indirectly exploited in early 20th century sunlight therapy for tuberculosis. And overarching it all is the DNA trade-off, the same UVB that synthesizes. Vital hormone can also create thymine dimers, activating nucleotide excision repair and setting dose-dependent cancer risk. These are not disconnected pieces. They are a network where photons are the common input. When you step outside for 15-20 minutes at midday, you simultaneously activate vitamin D synthesis, enhance calcium absorption for bone, support muscle function, release nitric oxide for blood vessels, synchronize the SCN for sleep, increase serotonin for mood, and provide foundation for nighttime melatonin. When you stay indoors under 300 lux for many hours, you reduce the amplitude of all those axes at once. The important thing is to understand simultaneity. Light does not select one system. It touches many systems simultaneously. That is why I call it a biological drug, not because it is magical, but because it has multi-system effects with defined mechanisms. But like every drug, it has an optimal dose and toxicity threshold. Exceed the optimal window, DNA damage and skin cancer risk rise. Fall below the minimum threshold, hormones and biological clock weaken. The science here does not support sun worship or sun fear. It supports understanding dose. In this integrated system, you see a dynamic balance. Enough UVB to activate calcitriol, but not exceed DNA repair capacity. Enough morning lux to reset the SCN, but not overuse blue light at night. Enough UVA to release nitric oxide, but not prolonged exposure causing damage. When you arrange vitamin D, circadian entrainment, serotonin, nitric oxide, bone, muscle, immune, and DNA trade-off into the same diagram, you no longer see light as a single factor. You see it as a foundational regulatory axis. And in a civilization where most time passes indoors, understanding that axis is no longer academic curiosity. It is part of how you design your living days. Because when photons are the common input to multiple physiological systems, how you manage photons is how you manage a large part of your biology. One photon. Not an abstract concept, but a particle of light leaving the surface of the sun, crossing 93 million miles of vacuum in about 8 minutes, 20 seconds, without slowing, without hesitation, according to relativity. For that photon, no time passes between emission and impact on you. For you, it is different. For you, the moment it hits your skin can be the start of a reaction breaking one carbon bond in one tiny molecule. One bond, just one bond. But from that one bond, a hormone forms. Hundreds of genes adjust activity, calcium is absorbed, blood vessels dilate, biological clock resets, serotonin rises, all beginning from one extremely small physical event. Tomorrow morning, when you wake up, that equation is still running. Earth is still tilted 23.5 degrees. The orbit continues. Photons are still emitted from the sun in enormous density. The question is not whether the system works. The question is whether you place yourself in the path of the photons. 15 minutes in the first hour after waking, standing outdoors. No glass, no walls can provide sufficient lux intensity to activate melanopsin, synchronize the SCN, and begin raising serotonin. If it is midday, 10 to 20 minutes may be enough to nearly reach the vitamin D synthesis plateau without exceeding skin DNA repair capacity. I am not saying this is preaching. Not you must do this. Physics does not care whether you follow. The equation still runs. If you stay indoors, photons do not hit your skin and eyes. If you step outside, they do. Your biological system responds to the number of photons received, not to your intentions. What I am inviting you to do is not to believe in light as something mystical. I am inviting you to see it as a quantifiable input, like calories or heart rate. Tomorrow morning, when you feel light on your face, you can think of those 8 minutes, 20 seconds. You can think of one bond broken. You can think of hundreds of genes in your body beginning to adjust activity. And you can realize that you are participating in a physical biological process that has been running for billions of years before offices, before screens, before the concept of modern lifestyle. I am not asking you to change your entire life. I am asking you to try one simple thing. 15 minutes in the morning. Not because I say so, not because of a trend, but because the equation between sun and body has existed for a long time. It does not negotiate, does not stop, does not wait for you. Tomorrow morning, photons will arrive. The only question is whether you will be there to receive them. If you want to continue exploring the hidden mechanisms behind what seem like obvious things in everyday life, please subscribe so we can keep asking hard questions and going to the very end of physics. I will see you in the next video, and until then, don't forget the equation is still running.